Can you all hear me, or is it better if I use a mic? You want to do, is that better?
Yeah.
Better? Okay, we'll do this. So good evening. I'm so pleased to see such a wonderful turnout tonight, and it's a really great mix of veteran and new faces. So welcome to the Columbia University Seminar on Cultural Memory, whether you've attended meetings in the past or are joining us for the first time. My name is Kate Trebuss, and I have been the rapporteur for the Cultural Memory Seminar for the past 2 years now. I'm also a graduate student in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia, and a member of the Women Mobilizing Memory Working Group, which is the group that will be presenting this evening. Tonight, I join you in a slightly different capacity from my usual rapporteuring capacity as the moderator for what promises to be a stimulating, rich roundtable discussion entitled Memory for the Future, Collaborative Witnessing in Post-Dictatorship Chile. Tonight's event is a special one because it is being co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of Social Difference and features a group of young scholars, graduate students, who are all participants in CSSD's Women Creating Change Initiative as members of the Women Mobilizing Memory Working Group, chaired by Marianne Hirsch, also one of the two co-chairs of this seminar, Jean Howard and Diana Taylor. This interdisciplinary transnational working group, which has been meeting in person and online almost monthly for over a year and a half now, is comprised of a remarkable mix of scholars, artists, activists, writers, and students living, working, and studying in New York, Chile, and Turkey. Gender serves as an important analytic lens for the Women Mobilizing Memory Group, which seeks to engage and engender feminist praxis through which to explore, and here I am quoting from the project description available online, the political stakes and consequences of witnessing and testimony as responses to socially imposed vulnerability and historical trauma, asking what strategies of memorialization and reimagining are most effective in calling attention to past and present wrongs and in creating possibilities of redress, and, I would add, new visions for potential futures. This past December, the Women Mobilizing Memory Group convened in Santiago de Chile for a 4-day workshop hosted jointly by the Center for the Study of Social Difference, Columbia's Global Center in Santiago, the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics, and colleagues affiliated with the Universidad de Chile, the Universidad Católica de Chile, and the nonprofit organization SAO. Those of us not from Chile arrived in Santiago on the second and final day of Chile's general elections. This year, a race between left-wing candidate Michelle Bachelet, whose father died of a heart attack not long after he was tortured by military officials in the months immediately following the 1973 coup d'etat, and right-wing candidate Evelyn Matthei, whose father served as an Air Force general throughout Pinochet's regime. The contemporary political environment into which we landed served as a powerful reminder throughout our visit of the vitality and ongoing relevance of cultural memory in present-day life. During this 4-day workshop, many of our members met face-to-face for the first time, and together, along with several Chilean survivors of torture and detention, we visited multiple sites where Chilean citizens and their supporters were subjected to numerous forms of state violence under Pinochet, as well as sites where survivors, their descendants, and a new generation of Chilean youth have sought to bear witness to this disturbing chapter in Chile's history, and to make sense in its aftermath of its relation to more distant pasts, present social and political challenges, and competing visions for Chile's future. Moving constantly between English and Spanish, we attended and contributed to a series of public events and performances, and participated in several focused discussion sessions on the topic of cultural memory in post-dictatorship Chile. Over and over again, we found ourselves asking, as Mariana Hausdorff Andrade, one of the Chilean graduate students in our group, puts it, ¿Cómo construir y reconstruir una memoria volcada a la acción? Una memoria que no sea estática, sino móvil y que surja de la experiencia de los sujetos. Or in English, how does one build and rebuild a memory devoted to action? A memory that is not static, but mobile, and that emerges from the experiences of the subjects. In their presentations, Nicole Gervasio and Henry Castillo will discuss some of the particular sites we visited during the workshop, raising important questions about what Nicole calls quote, the representational politics behind institutionalized sites of cultural memory, and the ways in which, according to Henry, places that are reclaimed as sites of memory may function as stages for the performance and invention of identity. What, we ask, is our role as scholars of memory, as well as as well as outsiders, visitors to Chile, tourists even, in this process of producing, preserving, and transmitting Chile's cultural memory as we move through such sites? What are the ethical and epistemic implications of practicing what Andrea Crow calls immersive methodologies, which seek to reproduce experience through extra-textual encounters with the physical sites and subjects of memory? And what, if anything, is accomplished by our efforts as feminists at what we might call collaborative witnessing, at, upon, and within sites of memory that are often much contested zones of conflict over an unstable, dynamic past that is ever in flux, to borrow an apt phrase from Leticia Robles-Moreno. Although many more questions emerged during and after our group's encounter in Chile, I will stop here and turn things over to my four colleagues, who will each share with you his or her own particular perspective on the manifold forms of memory work that we witnessed and performed together during our time in Chile, and that we continue to grapple with after this initial encounter. Before I do, though, I want to read a short excerpt from a reflection that one of the Chilean graduate student participants in our group wrote about the meaning of encounters and exchanges, like our recent encuentro in Santiago. I'll read from the original Spanish text first, please forgive my accent, and then the translation. Ivan Smirnow, a graduate student of Gender and Culture Studies at the Universidad de Chile, writes, Siempre he pensado que en este tipo de eventos, los cruces de caminos son parte fundamental. Se cruzan caminos y se ponen a circular palabras que tocan y que pasan por los cuerpos y que se vuelven parte de esos cuerpos, condicionando nuevas posibilidades. Ya sea en el largo plazo, cuando los encuentros se vuelven vínculos, como en el corto plazo, en el momento mismo del encuentro, desde la disposición a escuchar y a compartir. En estos encuentros, algo se transforma. And in English, I've always thought that in these kinds of events, it is the crossroads that are crucial. Paths converge and words circulate, touch and pass through bodies, and become a part of those bodies, generating new possibilities. Either in the long term, when the encounters become bonds, or in the short term, at the very moment of the encounter, out of the disposition to listen and to share. In these encuentros, something is transformed. As you savor Yvonne's words, it is my great pleasure to introduce each of my colleagues in the order that they will be speaking to you this evening. So I'm going to begin. Nicole is a third-year PhD student in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. Her work focuses on the transnational dimensions of state-sanctioned terror, violence against women, and queer survival in post-colonial and post-dictatorship literatures from the Global South. She also has a bachelor's degree in English and growth and structure of cities from Bryn Mawr College. Henry Castillo is a first-year PhD student in the Department of Performance Studies at New York University. He has an MA in Performance Studies from New York University and a BA in Applied Linguistics from the University of California, Los Angeles. His work focuses on race, gender, memory, and intangible cultural heritage in the Americas. He is also an actor and collaborates with the Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics as editorial assistant of digital books. And beside him is Leticia Robles-Moreno, who is a PhD candidate at New York University's Department of Performance Studies. Her MA thesis, Staging Real-Time, Absent Presences in Forging/Inhabiting Fragmented Bridges Through Video Chat Connections, explored the ways in which new technologies might be used to generate alternative political subjects, communities, and spaces of belonging. Her doctoral research focuses on the role of theater groups of creación colectiva in recent Latin American socio-political contexts, particularly in Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, and explores their network practices as strategies of survival through the combined perspective of performance studies and affect studies. And last, but certainly not least, is Andrea Crow on the end there. And Andrea is a second-year PhD student in the Department of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia University. She holds an MA in English with a specialization in interdisciplinary sexuality studies from Ohio State University and received a BA in English from Gonzaga University. She studies 17th century literature, poetry, and poetics, textual subcultures, and the history of sexuality. And so without saying anything more, Nicole, I'd like to hand things over to you.
Thank you, Kate.
Take it away from me.
All right, I'll try not to break anyone's eardrums because my voice is already pretty loud. So is this okay? Yeah? All right. Before I start, I just wanted to thank Lori Novak, one of our amazing photographers and professors who came with us, for incidentally providing me with most of my photos, which yours are much better than mine. So I'm glad, because I did not ask permission. Okay.
Part of the collective.
When you lose your name in a place like this, you don't forget. Those were some of the first words that Pedro Mata, our tour guide at Villa Grimaldi, a former torture center on the outskirts of Chile's capital, said to our working group. Mata had survived torture during the early years of Pinochet's regime. He recounted being renamed number 209 in 1975, when he entered this torture camp. Villa Grimaldi had once been a 19th century gathering place for weekend parties among Santiago's leisure class. Throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, however, the estate served as the most notorious site for so-called refined methods of torture. Over the past 2 decades, activists and survivors like Mata have reclaimed the estate, quite literally transforming the demolished detention center into a communal peace park. Now the space bears the residues of a series of contested histories. It continues to function as a peace park, doubling as a memory site that has been grafted onto a former camp. Performance studies scholar Diana Taylor, also a faculty member in our group, has remarked upon Villa Grimaldi's multivalence. In her essay, Trauma as Durational Performance, she describes the site's multivalence as serving at least 4 functions: evidentiary, commemorative, reconciliatory, pedagogical. To these 4 functions, I would like to add aspirational. Sites of cultural memory, in Chile and elsewhere, are always constructed around their anticipated reception in the future. What aspects of the past will this concrete representation in public space provoke? Such sites also aspire to represent present-day witnesses and survivors clamoring for recognition of past injustices through multiple spatial narratives. However, representational politics, despite being highly complex in the Chilean context, do not give way to what literary critic Michael Rothberg has termed competitive memory. Competitive memory misperceives the interaction between collective memories and the public sphere as a, quote, struggle for recognition in the midst of scarce resources. On the contrary, representations of collective trauma in Santiago's cultural memory sites have sought to dispel a myth of scarcity, particularly by multiplying testimonies grounded in gender and sexuality, perhaps the most taboo objects of torture. In my part for tonight's panel, I'm interested in thinking through a few details from 3 memory sites that we visited on our trip. Using vastly different strategies, these sites aspire to a new future and also represent multiple interests simultaneously. Activists who have pioneered these 3 sites, Villa Grimaldi, the Museum of Memory and Human Rights, and the National Stadium, have faced a number of ideological hurdles. Such obstacles have ranged from arch-conservative denials of torture and forced disappearance under Pinochet, to an inability, even amongst survivors, to agree on how best to represent collective trauma. The lack of a coherent master narrative surrounding state terror in Chile can certainly be said to contribute perniciously to denialist framings of the atrocities that happened from 1973 to 1990. However, I propose that the lack of institutionalized cohesion has also enabled narrative strands to proliferate quite freely. The diversity of aspirations being represented across these memory sites brings to voice a vibrant range of stories in the public sphere. In other words, there is no preset, institutionalized narrative for retelling these traumatic events. As a result, a myriad of difficult and even contradictory, highly personalized stories of survival has risen up in place of a dominant storyline. While Pedro Mata recounted for us his own story of being tortured in Villa Grimaldi, children playing on the other side of the park fence provided an unsettling soundtrack. Sculptures like the leaf pictured here have been refurbished from found objects and rubble from the old camp. Another leaf sculpture like this marked where a pickup truck used to discard or remove blindfolded victims. These sculptures display their own representational ambivalence, turning the literal keystones of torture chambers from trash into art. The art itself, perhaps not coincidentally, actually made for very shaky, uneven ground on which to stand. Shallow, gravestone-like plaques marked where specific buildings have once stood. Mata showed us a wintry architectural replica of the original camp, pictured here, which frankly made zero impression on my own mental map. Instead of reconstructing the walls of collapsed buildings in the Peace Park, I found my mind preoccupied with the damage done to bodies like Mata's. He described having been imprisoned in no unsparing terms. Gendered humiliation surfaced as a linchpin of torture. Those who renovated Villa Grimaldi chose not to eradicate that fact, but to root it literally in the soil itself, through interventions like this rose garden. Each rose bears the name of a woman brought into Villa Grimaldi to be raped, tortured, or disappeared. A familiar, even stereotypically romantic symbol thus transmutes into a memento for mourning, irreparable sexual violence. To the extent that these roses regenerate a public space, then, they also seek to repair a clandestine, privatized site of state terror that formerly cultivated only social death. Whereas Villa Grimaldi aspired to exorcise the ghosts of torture by leveling out the old landmarks with serenity, the Museum of Memory and Human Rights sought to unearth all documentary evidence of the dictatorship. A project begun in 2010 under the direction of recently re-elected President Michelle Bachelet, the museum represents the first large-scale, government-funded endeavor to institutionalize memory of the Pinochet era. The image on the right offers a snapshot of the protest posters, blown-up photographs, yellowing newspapers, and dead-end identification papers that filled the museum. In the midst of display cases stands a blacked-out cardboard cutout of a disappeared woman, Maria Edith Vasquez. "Did you forget me?" her caption asks, playing on the yes-no answers in the 1988 plebiscite that removed Pinochet from power. Maria's genderless silhouette thus distends like a pall over the fractious political backdrop brought to light in the museum. The left image shows the interior of a meditation space facing hundreds of framed photos of disappeared family and friends, donated by the general public. Here, the family photo, rather than a nostalgic token of love and posterity, becomes a public placard for active resistance against cultural amnesia. The candlelight reflects off the glass enclosure in such a way as to create the illusion of bodiless flames holding vigil. Rare in the museum were physical artifacts, like this metal bed frame and electrocution device, which needed no context to describe on whom and for what purpose they were used. In my last few minutes, I turn briefly to the women's cell block at the National Stadium, which Henry will take up further. I wanted to share a few of my own impressions of the aspirational possibilities in this dilapidated dressing room. In contrast to the disorienting archive at the museum and the placid overhaul in the Peace Park, activists hope to preserve the cell block, a hub for experimental torture, in its decrepit state. They want to represent past torture and its present-day traces as authentically as possible. However, because no written record exists of detainees at the National Stadium, the site's caretakers have said that they've had trouble garnering funding and political support. At no other time in our research trip, however, did the permanence of embodiment become so evident to me than at the stadium. The female body was omnipresent here, in handprints and bullet holes on the chipped front walls. Sneaker-patterned sludge latticed the orange tile around the ominous drains near the women's toilets. At one point, I picked up my bag from the ground, only to find my palm smeared with rusty mud. I remember feeling a little guilty about eviscerating these residues of history once again, this time with my travel-size Purell. I wondered to myself, what is this stuff? Mud from construction workers' boots, the backwash from dirty water that ran too sparingly over bruised women's breasts almost 40 years ago. And what about that handprint out front? Was it red with blood from the firing squad? Was it a signature in the menstrual blood for which detainees were not permitted sanitary napkins? Or had a dumb tourist just gotten reddish mud on her hand and pressed it voyeuristically against the entranceway to a history that is not hers? The only detail that seems incontestable are the bullet holes. Perhaps the only hopeful sign for the body at whom the gun must have aimed is the absence of a stain circling any of them. In any case, any single memory site might not be able to aspire to, much less attain, peacefulness and resistance, hope and violence, rejuvenation and degradation in the same space. Nevertheless, these three spaces show that representational politics need not compete with, but, rather, can quite aptly complement and even fulfill each other's lingering aspirations. Thank you.
coming. I have a slide to show. Okay. By the way, what I committed was grand death because I stole a picture from both Lori and Kate.
One of the advantages to these collaborative projects.
Yes. Anyway, Estadio Nacional, Memoria Nacional, National Stadium, national memory. There is no society without identity, and there is no identity without memory, writes the Regional Metropolitan Association of Former Political Prisoners in Chile, a survivors group who spent years lobbying in its story to be told to spectators who are often unaware of the gruesome history of Estadio Nacional, a sports stadium turned detention center under Pinochet's dictatorship. Used as a concentration camp, political prison, and torture center during the days following the coup of 1973, Estadio Nacional held over 20,000 citizens, many of whom were tortured and some lost their lives. Today, the stadium continues to function as a public sports entertainment arena despite detention cells and other instruments of repression still lining its interior. The survivors group seeks to harness the memories of Estadio Nacional with guided tours for students and other visitors. With financial and programmatic support from the coalition in March and April 2011, stadium tours guides received training in human rights and crimes against humanity, dictatorship, and the history of Chile's Unidad Popular government so that they could interpret the stadium's history to the public for the first time. So that's the general picture of the stadium. Wally Kunzman, president of Estadio Nacional, Memoria Nacional, and committee of the former political prisoners, have dreamed of this moment for years. In 2003, when the stadium was declared a historical monument, a symbolic stone was placed in the site in the hopes that a memorial would one day come to stand here. Last Tuesday, these efforts came through, as people gathered at Estadio Nacional for the inauguration of the memorial. It is reported that children and grandparents of victims gathered in a circle to remember what happened 40 years ago. El Memorial Grecia, the Grace Memorial, name of the site. This is under construction on Tuesday. It was presented officially, and the whole wall is there, and there's a plaque also. El Memorial Grecia, the Grace Memorial, name of the site, is an ambitious project spread across the stadium. It includes a larger rectangular mural in contemporary styles that reads "The Dark Times." In addition, 3 curated sections have been added. The first in the stadium's locker room, the second in an isolated section in the lower bleachers behind one of the goals, and the third in a former Olympic pool, a recently discovered section where women were held. Wally and Teresa is the second guy who's representing Marcial here on her behalf, as Teresa's son. Put in context the recollection of the events while evoking those who were detained, tortured, and disappeared at the stadium. The painful memories of the Estadio Nacional are also narrated with dignity. Certainly both Wally and Teresa are fully aware that they are not only speaking on their behalf, but also for those whose voices were silenced. Within this context, the question then arises as to what social identities are performed when reclaiming architectural public spaces at sites of memory. Our December visit taught us that for those invested in preserving the historical memories as lesson of Estadio Nacional, this reclaiming process is embodied as both a space and a gender intervention. Urban studies introduce the concept of that space in our culture can be real, virtual, and also organized around gender. Produce by material as well as non-material aspects of society, gender spaces exhibit biases toward one or another sex. Aspects of the material environment, such as masculine associated themes in stadiums, help define spaces according to dominant gender views. Masculine spaces are places where traditional men have congregated more commonly than women, and where males are at distinct advantage regarding the deployment of power. Places that can be characterized as masculine spaces facilitate the expression of male bias activities and power as they reproduce the exclusively male discourse, albeit in the exaggerated and most centrally and alienated fashion. The memories of the Estadio Nacional attest to the examples of rape and other forms of sexual abuse that illustrated the constitution of the female body as a site of political conflict and violence. Under Pinochet's military state, women related to men were considered enemies of the military junta, and women with an identity to their own as ex-political leaders, workers, and professionals were mercilessly punished through direct torture, the extrajudicial execution of family members, the disappearing of loved ones, and the severing of the family's ties through exile and poverty. The performance of violating the female body that characterized everyday life in the stadium calls attention to the different techniques that the male body executed on the female body during the incarceration process. I suggest that these performances may be one of the most commonly overlooked aspects of the dark period in Chile's history. Because of international regulations in sports, Estadio Nacional has undergone rebuilding and renovation. Nevertheless, the curated sections for the memorial retain most of the original architectural styles of the 70s. In that sense, the space invokes the past through the empty, old-fashioned lower stands that emerge alone in the gallery located behind the score. Its front presence emerges as a powerful statement. It invokes the absent. It speaks of the disappearing body. Its perpetual silence claims for social justice. The site also questions the present, as one of the ironies of the memorial is that it wasn't until 2010, under President Sebastián Piñera's center-right government, that the committee's petition bore fruit. The project for memorial was incorporated in the government plans for 2014 South American Games to be held in Santiago this month. In that sense, the memorial also serves as a political piece of criticism on the center-left consultation administrators who held power from return to democracy in 1990 to beginning of Piñera's government for their inaction with regard to the memorial. Finally, the site also challenges the future because in the end, what emerges from the memorial is an ongoing site of exchange, mourning, interrogation, and phantasm that Wallis and Teresa Combres will never see, but the legacy of the memorial will live for the next generations so that such a perverse events never happen again. I would add, if I haven't exhausted my 8 minutes, I would add that also from an architectural perspective, I think particularly this space in the stands challenges this idea of the sacred and the secular. I think that the conjunction of these two aspects, one might argue, is not necessarily a way to build a memorial because it might tribalize the memorial as a sacred places. But I think one of the beauties of tourism is that it allows also for circulation of knowledge. So in that sense, this space might gain some visibility, and by gaining that visibility, the message of the memorial, could be also embedded in that aspect. So in that sense, I think it's a positive thing if people in soccer games at some point pose and take pictures, because again, that would circulate the knowledge, that would circulate the voice, that will remember us that these horrible events happen at the stadium. Thank you.
Oh, no, really?
That's fine.
Hello. Okay, I'm going to be brief. So, this experience that Kate has talked about, and we all, I'm very, very privileged and happy to be being part of, was a privileged space to rethink my own research on network practices and collective encounters. I am particularly interested in the notion of transgenerational memory and how stories are transmitted, and the official history is contested. Our presence in Santiago during a historical moment, the re-election of Michelle Bachelet as President of Chile, as well as our visits to sites of memory that Nicole and Henry represented, and also our interaction with the protagonistas de la historia, the protagonists of recent history, suggests that memory is not a contained entity, but a fluid experience that constantly morphs. Mobilizing bodies through geopolitical borders surface an experience of memory in the making. I want to bring 3 moments where time, body, and space conflated and unveiled a processual and relational experience of sharing memories. The first one is our conversation with Javiera Parada, leader of the citizen collective Marca Tu Voto AC. I think Andrea will talk a little bit about it. We all know Javiera. So, during the recent presidential elections in Chile, this movement called on voters to write the letters AC, AC, in the election ballots, symbolically demanding a new constitution. Although the dictatorship is over, the neoliberal constitution left by Pinochet is a legacy that continues inflicting violence upon Chilean citizens. This picture of Javiera Parada and Michelle Bachelet from October 2013, before the elections, could be an example of an encounter of 2 generations. Bachelet, a survivor of the dictatorship, and Parada, the daughter of a brutally murdered victim. But this encounter also defies the idea of unidirectionality through time, the idea of a generation that comes after a previous generation. Parada is one of thousands of young Chileans who now suffer the social costs of Pinochet's neoliberal economic model, which affects their right to public education, among other issues. One interpretative approach to the ongoing participation of new generations in Chilean political projects is to consider that young citizens are taking over old struggles, as if they had inherited the socio-political responsibility to fight against oblivion. However, this approach does not consider how new generations can also have an influence on their elders. Contrary to the idea of taking over what comes from the past and the assumption of a clean, unidirectional division between generations, Javiera Parada's role in Chile's politics suggests a relational transformation in time, a multi-layered contact where different times conflate and new struggles redefine what has been left by the past. The second moment I would like to recall is María José Contreras' performance, Habeas Corpus. Contreras embodied a semi-blind, pregnant mother justice, beaten, washed, and weakened, but determined to act. She reads a letter that her uncle, a military man during the dictatorship, left to be destroyed after his death. Contreras received the letter from her father. a confession. This letter was a confession of complicity with the regime. She reads it for the audience and then destroys it, performing a gesture that erases memory at the same time that multiplies it. This gesture salutes the hundreds of cases ignored by Chilean justice. The legal figure of the habeas corpus, which you might have the body or the body might be present, invokes the body in different levels. The pregnant body of Maria José Contreras, strong and vulnerable at the same time, summoning the bodies of thousands of Chilean women that, as Nicole has mentioned, suffer gender humiliation. Also, she is invoking the bodies of victims in the wait for justice, who are bouncing aimlessly in the Palacio de Tribunales de Justicia, the Courts of Justice Palace of Santiago, where this piece was performed. And also the bodies of an audience compounded by Chilean, Turkish, Colombian, Peruvian, and US citizens. Maria José's performance moved in between her family history and Chilean socio-political history, in front of a transnational group of people, in a unique space where she probably will never perform again. The next day after Michelle Bachelet was re-elected, was a really unique moment. This confluence of circumstances also offers new perspectives for our understanding of how memory is transmitted. How much of this transmission relies in the co-presence of bodies? How this co-presence shapes that transmission and interpolates it. It is clear how much Maria José offered to us, the audience. But what did we offer to her? Again, to what extent the transmission of memory is multidirectional. Moreover, let's not forget that Maria José was pregnant at the time of this performance, a particular moment where the co-presence of bodies is regional. We could say that she is transmitting or will transmit her uncle's story and the history of her country to her newborn son when he comes to an age to understand those horrors. But we can also tell that this is also his story and his history already. Through this performance, it is possible to imagine transgenerational transmission of memory not as a vertical relation mother-son, since her child moved her towards action. The future came into presence, or into the present. Finally, the third moment I want to highlight from our experience is a particular journey of bodies in time and space. The Chilean diaspora that emerged from the exiles pushed by the dictatorship had to fight their own struggles. With the return of democracy, people went back to the country and retraced memory. As a group, we had the privilege of sharing our trip with Doña Teresa Anativia, survivor of the dictatorship, and her son Marcial Godoy Anativia, raised by her in the United States. What circumvolutions in time and space, what coincidences, what encounters made possible this co-presence. Our transnational academic collaborations made it clear that both space and time have become more fluid. Moreover, new technologies, social networks, and contemporary visual imagery allowed an immediate and dynamic circulation of information and shared memories. Actually, this picture comes from Facebook, from the Facebook page of another collaborator of the group. Doña Teresa and Marcial re-encountered Chile in a very unique contingency and revisited their country's history within a transnational context. Marcial would ask his mom that tell that story, reinstating and at the same time expanding acts of memory sharing. Also, at some point, new stories emerged, activated by this particular encounter. This was memory in the making, embedded in the presentness of our presence in Chile, and awakened by transnational connections and networks. Memory in the making that also relied in the immediacy of these connections via the digital. As a group, our own way of documenting this experience using iPhones, Flickr, Google Drives, and Facebook revealed how media reshapes how we remember and how we share memories. We now crave for the details, the specificities of the information. Moreover, the multiplicity of shared and sharing platforms offer options for alternative histories and counter-memories, or competitive memories. To conclude, I would like to point out the ethical responsibility brought by an experience like this, and Andrea is going to go further on this. There is no pure witnessing, no zero intervention. Our presence already mobilizes change. Our words, our vision, our bodies have an impact in the contingency we inhabit. We bring with ourselves a repertoire of embodied knowledge. Thus, our senses make an experience like this unavoidable in its challenge and touching in its materiality. To talk about memory for the future requires assuming our own role and our own collaboration in this endeavor.
Can you hear okay? Okay. Good evening, and thank you all for coming. I don't need anything on there.
Oh, you don't?
Probably low tech.
Okay, I'll just break everything in the process.
So now that my colleagues have familiarized you with some of the major features of our trip, I'd like to reflect on our project on a meta level. Specifically, I want to talk about methodology. The work that we've been doing in Women Mobilizing Memory is in many ways an experiment in the public humanities. Strongly informed by cultural memory studies and transnational feminist practice, our working group is attempting to think critically and transformatively about the arenas in which the public humanities operate, the epistemological limits of our methods, and especially the ethical and socio-political ramifications of our work. I have two goals today. First, I want to describe and evaluate our methodologies, and second, I'm hoping to get feedback from all of you on these very preliminary ideas. Ultimately, I want the ideas I'm presenting here to build towards a project on the future of the academic humanities, focusing specifically on theorizing productive methodologies. Speaking generally, the Women Mobilizing Memory project combines two modes of engagement that are each widely practiced in academia, but rarely combined. I would term the first of these modes of engagement the immersive, and the second I call the distanced. I associate immersive methodologies with small-scale, often local approaches that stage intimate encounters, not in order to produce data or enforce a particular interpretive framework, but rather oriented towards precisely the opposite ends, recreating experience in order to postpone conclusion and sustain the process of meaning-making. Close reading, ethnography, memoir, and local activist engagements are examples of such immersive methods. On the other hand, distanced methodologies are invested in extracting general or transportable information, information terms and tactics. This mode would include large-scale quantitative textual analysis, comparative or transnational projects, and efforts promoting wide public recognition of some paradigm, fact, or historical narrative. These approaches often find their home in the digital humanities, a field that, like the immersive critical reading techniques I mentioned earlier, most often gets cited as a potential savior of the academic humanities, although these two approaches, the digital humanities and the close critical reading, are rarely championed at the same moment. The dangers of distanced approaches are obvious to anyone coming from a feminist or otherwise critical and socially progressive frame of reference. Distance can produce a loss of subtlety, reduce difference, and shut down inquiry by appearing to offer objective answers. The strength of this approach, however, comes in precisely where immersive methodologies encounter their limits. The reopening of experience and suspension of conclusion that are proper to immersivity demands a radical skepticism, a total attentiveness to detail and context, and an acceptance of the relativity and contingency of any interpretation. This makes it difficult to make any claims at all, let alone to make claims that lead to any action other than the continuation of thoughtful retrospection. In our conversations in Chile, the two comments that generated the most controversy, and thus were probably hitting on something important, pointed to precisely these concerns. One of our participants described a particular photojournalistic project as a failed conversation, observing that while it captured images of life under Pinochet, its political effect is hard to measure at best. Many jumped on this comment, countering that the affiliative networks built among those who engaged in the project, networks that are still thriving today, held significant political value, while others reframed the project as not a failed conversation, but rather a disrupted one, picked up by a later historical moment. Yet uncertainty regarding the extent to which individual, experiential, immersive methods can be widely effective or create change remained in everyone's mind. On the other hand, the distance, ends-driven perspective of the historian, policymaker, or researcher was likewise subject to critique. The comment that most stuck with me came from an artist activist heavily involved in political movements in dictatorship and post-dictatorship Chile. She argued that post-facto scholarly research on and interpretations of such histories, quote, evacuate feeling. She characterized these approaches from a distance as out of touch with and even undermining of the experiences they analyze. Women mobilizing memories at once immersive and distance methodologies works against the limits of each approach. Seeking connections across significant disciplinary and geographical distances allows the group to access an extensive network of influence in diverse realms of public life, from art spaces to classrooms to polling stations. Yet the immersivity of the group's methods prevent this breadth of reach and breadth of perspective from leading to inattentiveness or presumption. Engaging in personal face-to-face encounters with other people, especially in the context of non-instrumentalized interactions that are much more likely to take place in person than across digital platforms, produces unexpected revelations, unsettles assumptions, and most importantly, builds solidarity that can sustain activist and intellectual networks for the long term. I encountered a similar methodology being framed by the Marca Tu Voto campaign that Leticia has told you about. Javiera Parada, one of the major organizers of this campaign, described her realization that while her movement was able to reach a wide audience via digital platforms, in order to have a wider influence, the group would have to pursue much more seriously face-to-face encounters. They would have to knock on doors and approach people on the street, not only to reach a much wider socioeconomic sector — digital technology is, after all, of course, no leveler — but also to make personal connections, to prevent their message from being muted by the mediation of a screen and lost among the million other voices circulating in the ether. Likewise, the memorials taking shape at the Estadio Nacional, which Nicole and Henry have described, similarly aim at both distance and immersion. These memorials affirm a definite account of the human rights violations that took place under the dictatorship and aim at passing this account into a wide, even global, cultural memory. Yet at the same time, by maintaining physical features from the stadium of the 1970s, the memorial insists on the ongoing reality of that history as a present context shaping the current moment. The structure of the memorial opens the past to be re-experienced in an intimate and immersive way. Returning to the Women Mobilizing Memory Project, and specifically to what role its methodologies enable the academic humanities to play in a larger public sphere, the group's combination of immersive and distance methodologies is, to say the least, difficult to carry out. The working group's attempt to address a wide audience and operate across diverse cultural and geographic contexts is in tension with a strong awareness of the fact that all answers will be incomplete. This sense of a mandate to work across boundaries, yet as a result never being able to claim the position of an expert, is becoming exacerbated as we move towards our next workshop, entering the totally new and heated context of contemporary Turkish politics. The starkness with which our working group's methodology of immersion across distance brings out the inadequacy of the individual knowledge worker, however, may be one of the most important insights it brings to the future of a university culture still unproductively bound to the method of the monograph and the glorification of individual genius. Immersion across distance drives home the fact that knowledge is best and in fact only produced collaboratively. Ultimately, this methodology pushes towards a reconsideration of how we understand and organize academic labor.
questions. We just wanted to share a couple of passages from the document that we handed to you earlier, which are reflections from 3 of the Chilean graduate students who were part of our working group. They obviously could not be here tonight for various reasons, mostly distance, but they really wanted to contribute something, and so we're just going to read an excerpt, first in Spanish, the original Spanish, and then the English translation from 2 of the authors. I read a little snippet from Yvonne's contribution in my introductory remarks, and we're going to hear first from Leticia reading from Constanza's piece, and then from there we'll go to a snippet from Mariana's piece.
We really wanted to bring the voices of our Chilean colleagues, precisely because this idea of networks and collaboration has really touched, I think, all of us really deeply. So we wanted to perform that gesture. Constanza dice, en Chile es usual escuchar a la gente que vivió la época decirle a la gente que no la vivió que no tienen derecho a opinar porque no estuvieron ahí. Sin embargo, yo creo que es nuestro trabajo como nuevas generaciones no solo hablar sobre el tema, sino también preguntar, denunciar, protestar, creer, reactualizar. Probablemente haya cosas que nunca entenderé, pues es cierto, no viví lo que ellos y ellas vivieron. No he sido torturada, no he sido estigmatizada, no he vivido el exilio, ni la censura, ni el toque de queda. Y sí, es cierto, hay un abismo entre ellos, ellas y yo, un inabarcable que escapa del lenguaje. Pero eso no quiere decir que tenemos que desistir en nuestro intento de acercarnos lo más posible, asumiendo que en toda superficie de contacto se corre el peligro de la contaminación. Pero quizás la contaminación no sea algo tan malo después de todo. Quizás es solo así como funciona la memoria. Quizás ese chaleco del que les hablé ni siquiera es azul. Leí hace tiempo el libro y quizás confundí su color.
Now I'll read the translation. It is not unusual in Chile to hear that those who lived through the dictatorship deny the opinion of those who didn't experience those times because they were not there. As new generations, however, I think our duty is not only to talk about those issues, but also to question, report, protest, create, and rewrite them. Probably there will be things that I will never understand, as indeed I didn't live what those men and women lived through. I haven't been tortured. I haven't been stigmatized. I have neither lived in exile nor experienced censorship or curfews. And, in fact, it's true that there is an abyss between them and me, something elusive beyond language. But that doesn't mean we have to abandon our attempts to maintain the closest possible contact by assuming that the entire contact surface runs the risk of contamination. But perhaps contamination may not be such a bad thing after all. Perhaps it's just how memory functions. Perhaps the vest I told you about before wasn't even blue. I read the book a while ago, and perhaps I misremembered its color.
Now I'm going to read Ivan Smirnov. Mariana, I'm sorry, Mariana. A partir del encuentro en Chile del grupo Women Mobilizing Memory. Sin lugar a dudas, la posibilidad que hemos tenido como jóvenes investigadores de ser parte del trabajo y discusión de este grupo ha sido muy enriquecedora. Esto por diversos motivos. En lo personal, este encuentro me permitió ponerme en perspectiva respecto a muchos de los conflictos que han emergido en los procesos de memoria de nuestro país. Muchos de ellos tienen antecedentes históricos, sociales y culturales, entre otros, que ya había dejado de ver por estar en medio de estos conflictos. Mi mirada ya había naturalizado distintos aspectos, los cuales volví a problematizar en el ejercicio de verlos nuevamente. Pero a través de la mirada de ustedes, en términos epistemológicos, este ejercicio fue muy relevante para entender mi propia práctica investigativa. Por otro lado, este encuentro puso en relieve la necesidad de crear y fortalecer las redes de distintos agentes que son parte de procesos de elaboración y reelaboración de memorias. Esto los compromete a ustedes y, por sobre todo, a nosotros, ya que me parece urgente la constitución de una red más transversal al interior de nuestro propio país. Y por último, luego de este encuentro, se refuerza en mí la pregunta por la acción. ¿Cómo construir y reconstruir una memoria volcada a la acción? Una memoria que no sea estática, sino móvil y que surja de la experiencia de los sujetos. Respecto a esto, recuerdo las palabras de la fotógrafa Kene Lorenzini en una de sus intervenciones. Me hice fotógrafa, me hice persona en la calle. Es la acción la que, en gran medida, nos constituye como sujetos y agentes de nuestra realidad, en constructores y transmisores de memoria.
Without any doubt, the possibility that we have had as young researchers of being part of the work and discussions of this group has been enlightening. This is because of several reasons. From a personal point of view, this encounter gave me another perspective in relation to many of the conflicts that have emerged in the processes of memory in our country. Many of these conflicts have historical, social, and/or cultural precedents, among others that I had lost sight of because I was in the middle of them. I had already normalized diverse aspects, which I problematized again after looking at them again, but through different eyes, your eyes. In epistemological terms, this exercise was relevant to my own research practice. On the other hand, this encounter highlighted the necessity to create and to strengthen networks between diverse actors who are part of processes of elaboration and re-elaboration of memories. This is a commitment for you and above all for us because I consider the construction of a more transversal network in our own country. Finally, after this encounter, it becomes more important to me the question about action. How to build and rebuild a memory devoted to action. A memory that is not static but mobile and that emerges from the experiences of the subjects. In relation to this point, I remember the words of the photographer Kene Lorenzini in one of her comments. Quote, "I became a photographer, I became a person in the street." It is an action that, to a large degree, transforms us into subjects and actors of our own reality, into makers and transmitters of memory. That's from Mariana Hausdorff, one of our co-graduate students.
And I'd like to take just a moment to thank Leticia and Henry for translating these at very short notice. They worked very diligently this weekend to get us these wonderful translations in time for tonight's event. So thank you to both of you for that. So I would love to open the floor. I mean, one of the things that I think we've all said is that we're really keen to hear feedback and comments from the group about some of the things that we've been discussing. So I'm going to open things up for questions and comments. And they can be either directed to the group as a whole or to individual members of the group. Yeah.
Hi. My name is Gregorio, and my father was engineer in Chile, the trustees for the Insurance Party. And so I'm a son of the Chilean Butch. And but I'm also an architect, and I'm the architect that is trying to save the memorial of Auschwitz, the Italian memorial of Auschwitz. So I have two questions. One is, what was the reaction and the relation with the Chilean people of you coming from an American academic context? And that brings me to another question. Don't you think that maybe we should act and try to make a memorial here in America about this putsch that was an American putsch, maybe near the School of Chicago, which is the place where this was organized? And this is a very important question. I mean, we should write a formal letter to Obama and ask to finance a memorial in Chile and here, because most of my friends don't know that this country organized and killed thousands of people in Chile. And the second thing I wanted to say, and it's also kind of a question, is that the Auschwitz Memorial I'm working for was made by Primo Levi, and the question related to my personal history in Chile and my father, both of them are very connected in a way. because Primo Levi used to insist very much on, and that's the reason why the Polish government wants to destroy this memorial. It's the oldest memorial in Auschwitz, about the working class question. My father often insists on the fact that the problem in Chile was the working class. I mean, America intervened there because to destroy the working class. So that thing also in the memorials are often forgotten. And also, you didn't really talk about the spontaneous memorials that were made during the dictatorship, that is often by the working class, by the way, that are very interesting also, and I don't know very much about this. And yeah, and the last thing, don't glorify too much Bachelor, because she is just continuing the politics of the Chicago school, and she's as guilty as Pinochet in a way. So, and we are perpetrating, the dictatorship is still there. So.
Who would like to respond to all these wonderful, these are all really wonderful questions, and I think raise so many of the issues that we were addressing in various ways throughout our time in Chile. In particular, our own implication in this history, and the question of the ways in which all of these histories of American imperialism, of the Chilean dictatorship, of the Holocaust are connected, and what our responsibilities are as scholars to bring out those connections and tease out the relationships. So I would love to hear what our members of our group, if anybody has a response to that question, then maybe we can turn to some of the other questions after.
I just can go with two comments. I think it's very interesting to listen about the glorification of Chile, because in our discussions and conversation with our Chilean colleagues, there was a really, really enlightening way of sharing from different perspectives. I mean, you would have people who believed in the Chilean, people who basically have lost faith in her. No? And I think that's why the work of Javiera Parada and Marco Tu Voto was particularly touching for me, or resonated with me, because that is a different view, a totally different. I mean, there could be a kind of a connection, and that's what that embrace that I was showing. But it's also this manifestation on the side of this newer generation who can see that what you have just mentioned, you know, the neoliberal constitution continues. Okay, why it hasn't changed yet? You know? And I think also would respond the first question you had, you know, how this is my experience. Our Chilean colleagues, we met some of them beforehand, we met some of them at that moment. I think it's been a, again, multi-directional conversation. I think many of our ideas have changed or have expanded in that context, and I also believe some of our colleagues' ideas also have expanded. We had a lot of conversations with the grad student side of the group, so I think we connected, you know, in a really, really, really good way. You know, just one more thing, just to because I know my colleagues have probably more comments. We visited some memorials related to the Holocaust all over Chile. So it's very interesting how history is touched, you know? But also, from my point of view, it's also the specificities are very important, you know? And also how, before going there, we learned a lot about Salvador Allende, his project, and what kind of long-term project was the dictatorship was, you know? So I think this experience also, from my point of view, help us to understand the connections and how we can talk about globalized sense of memory, you know, and also the local, you know, how important the specificities were. That's what I say.
Yeah, I would like to comment on the last point that Leticia just brought up, because I actually noticed while we were putting together our presentations that it seemed Like the pieces where we visited the Jewish heritage sites were the one thing that wasn't making it into any of our 4 presentations, and I was aware of that elision. And I think there was a partially logistical reason because we actually had to cut that part of the trip short we just didn't have time to go and develop all of the exposure to those sites that we wanted, and so I think none of us felt a particular facility with it. But beyond that pragmatic reason, there was also a really interesting dialogue that we started with 2 women from the Chilean side who were working on these questions, these transnational connections, named Jimena and Giselle. Giselle was of Jewish descent and had grown up in Chile, and she was telling us quite a lot, actually outside of these academic conversations, she was telling us quite a lot about the stigma associated amongst Jewish Chileans, how there was a sort of conservative element at work as well, and how she had also dealt with a lot of denialist rhetoric surrounding what had happened with the dictatorship, and how that was something that she felt that she was constantly batting up against in terms of figuring out how to navigate this conversation with someone who shared this heritage but didn't share any of these political leanings. And so it seemed like that tension was also being worked upon in the sites themselves, but I don't feel like I know enough about it to be able to discuss it. But I will say that I can definitely see where that connection between Auschwitz and Primo Levi would make perfect sense. And it is something that is being thought about on the ground, but in some ways it is much less talked about, I think, than some of the very sort of bald-faced conversations we had about torture itself and experiences that survivors had had. It actually seemed like there was more stigma surrounding that conversation.
Now, in regards to building a memorial here in the States, which I think is a wonderful idea, I think for that to happen, we first, in the States, our government has to express a sense of acknowledgement. And I think that's the most difficult part. And you as Chilean also might know that even in Chile, building this Museo de la Memoria and the Estadio Nacional, those projects have been very contested projects. So it is a wonderful utopia, but it remains to be seen whether or not we, as a democracy that we proclaim, will be one day, express that sense of acknowledgement. And I think about not only this memorial, I think other memorials. Where is the memorial for the My Lai massacre of Vietnam, for instance? Yeah.
Or slavery.
Yeah. So
Go ahead, sorry. I just was going to follow up on what you were saying, just that, yeah, I also love the idea of a Chicago-based memorial, but also I think one of the difficulties is that makes a splash when it first goes up and then doesn't get seen a lot of times. I mean, of course, it depends on the nature of the beast. But I think one thing we talked about a lot in Chile that I think would make the biggest difference, and before going actually, is a sort of curriculum change, because none of us, at least who were educated in the US, learned anything about Chile other than that rubber comes from there when we were growing up. So that's the kind of change that needs to happen to really, I think, produce a cultural memory.
Other questions from the group?
I wanted to ask Henry about the National Museum, National Stadium being made into a memorial. When you were there, did you get a chance to speak to any of the people who were basically imprisoned there and tortured there? And what do they think of that being a memorial? And the second question is, this is for everybody, I guess. What do people think of Allende in Chile today? What's the image of Allende?
Well, the first question, we were taken by Teresa and Wally, basically. And they were, as I mentioned, former detainees, and at the same time, they recollected part of the stories. I learned through Wally specifically that women have been also part of this detention center, specifically in the pool, in the Olympic pool. As I said, a zone that recently has been kind of rediscovered. So there's very much an investment, at least expressed from the women who took us to the specific site. And they care about the memorial. The proof of that is that they've been very consistent. There have been a lot of up and downs in this process, and finally, last week, it came through. So I think in that sense, that was for us very, very profound, knowing that it's possible, constructing this, building these spaces, these sites, that they're very political at the same time. And I like that perspective specifically.
But I asked the question because how do they think it's enough? I mean, is this just making a stadium into a memorial basically enough? That's number one. And secondly, it's sort of very unusual to have a memorial still function as a stadium, a stadium that's used for sports.
Yeah.
So is that, it's very unusual.
Yeah, that's one of the questions that on the way out I was thinking whether or not that place as a recreational place, as a place of entertainment, can also coexist as a sacred place, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I think they proved that yes, it is possible. As I said earlier, yeah, some people might in soccer games, be around the main wall that is by the entrance, and they will take the pictures and pose, for the cameras and do the piece, and I'll be here. But at the same time, that would create some sort of a reflection. That would create some curiosity, and I think that's the point, or that's one of the points, that the memorial exists, so it can create that conversation. It can develop, even if it's a conversation that is contested or people don't agree. I think is important to have.
The surviving detainees are okay with this? Are fine with this?
Well, I can't speak for all of them,
No,
but at least the three that I had the chance to talk to, yes. I don't know what kind of
It's a
feedback.
continued struggle, right? For example, one thing that Wally was telling us is that the swimming pool, the Estadio Nacional, had been remodeled without them knowing that. So that basically has been erased. And she actually was telling us that it was a loss. It's like how that space, which was a space of torture, is now functioning. But at the same token, the fight to get spaces, to get, for example, an office space there, was also significant. And she, as a leader of this group, was like really invested in that. So I also agree we cannot tell what everybody thinks or what if there's no consensus. But what is true and what we saw is that there are continuous struggles, in all this process, in contestations also.
Yeah, I would add that this is from Ivan's essay that unfortunately we couldn't read completely, but he mentioned to the point of what is the general consensus. Something that we perceived as well was the fact that it is the trivialization of the dictatorship and the regime and the hardships what to some extent bothers activists. And what I mean by the trivialization is that there's a series of TV shows, telenovelas, soap operas, and that is what to some extent people is tired of. They don't want to see this type of spectacles, this type of shows, because what they emphasize, because the emphasis is not in the historical, is not in the pedagogical, it is in romanticizing. It's a love story, basically. And that's the part that I noticed personally, people were kind of more uncomfortable with.
Yeah, and actually the point I was going to make was about television as well, which is that I think a detail, I apologize if you actually already did mention it, Henry, but it's something that leapt to mind in terms of thinking about what did cause frustration for survivors like Wally. was a discussion that we had surrounding the extent to which that pocket of the stadium that is being preserved as memorial is actually cut out of televised broadcasts of soccer games and whatever it is that happens in the stadium. So, you know, whereas I think it was actually Marcial who described it as a beautiful eyesore or something like that. And, you know, so we had this talk about, you know, thinking through the extent to which the beautiful eyesore does anything if you don't actually have it being mass represented, if like in those portrayals where it should be real and not telenovelized, you know, instead you just have what looks to be a perfectly pristine 21st century stadium. And so you actually lose that sort of resistant element that someone like Wally is trying to preserve and having that eyesore stay there.
Just a comment, but the point of a memorial is to have it where many people will see it. And I think individuals who suffered will have individual reactions to whatever memorial is built. The challenge would be to have those people who come remember what was there through time, through generations, so that it remains meaningful. That's really the challenge. It's not building the memorial.
And I think too that, I mean, and I don't want to speak for the group, but I'm going to. But I think too, a lot of us found that to be one of the most powerful, effective memorials that we visited, in part because it was so integrated, unavoidably integrated into day-to-day life that was continuing around it. I mean, this idea, again, the beautiful eyesore that when you're standing on the field, you can't not see. And that you have to figure out, well, how does this space actually mesh with all these other you know, seats and advertisements and scoreboards around it, and what is the relationship between this past that we've preserved in some sense and the present that is unfolding. And so it's not sequestered, it's not boxed up in, you know, in a museum and put away sort of, you know, as though it's distant. It's present in a very powerful way, I think. And I think we felt that, many of us, when we were there. You had a second question, and would you mind repeating it?
Yeah. What do people think of Allende? What's the image of Allende today among the Chileans?
But it's again, it's I mean, it comes from individual conversations. But one thing I can say is that during Bachelet's, the day of the election of Bachelet, the image of Allende was in big flags, you know, and it's very interesting how it could be really. I don't know if it had become like an empty signified. It's like it could signify whatever to one group. I mean, communism, socialism, or future, or revolution. So it's and from my point of view, it's really mobile, you know, and it depends on every story, you know, personal story.
Yeah, like the glasses were this sort of omnipresent symbol that kept being repurposed in all these different contexts, and very interesting. I think this phrase of the empty signifier is really important, and people would fill the lenses of these glasses metaphorically with whatever their purpose was. He's a very powerful symbolic figure, but a very flexible one in a lot of interesting ways. We also attended a series of performances at a museum that's dedicated to the memory of Allende, and yet it was hard, even in that space, it was hard to tell in what way they were doing that memory work. I mean, it was a space that was, I don't remember does anybody remember the exact name? Because it's a longer title of the museum than museums.
It's like Museo de Solidaridad.
Yeah, the Museum of Solidarity with Allende, and yet it isn't about. I mean, it's a contemporary art gallery in most of the rooms, and it's unclear what the relationship between the exhibits in that space are to the memory of Allende. And so I think that space in itself serves, I think, as a good suggestive image for what Allende means within Chilean context at the moment. But again, that's so varied and so local that I wouldn't want to generalize. Right?
So I was wondering, in your conversations with younger people, obviously the people you mainly encountered were people who were part of a group on mobilizing memory, so they're people necessarily interested in memory. But did they report any impatience or resistance to memory work and to being so immersed in the past? I mean, is there a feeling like, enough already, it's 40 years since the coup, it's so many years since the end of the dictatorship, could we just move to the future and let all this go? Or did you not find any resistance like that? And what, I mean, I'm still thinking about the Mariana Hausdorff's question about how do you construct a memory for action, and what's the balance between building memorials, honoring the past, responding to the needs of survivors, collecting their stories, testimony work, oral histories, all of that, and then thinking, well, we have to turn to the future and move on, and what is the balance there? Did you have any conversations that revealed any resistances to memory work?
So Nicole and I actually met up with a friend of a friend of mine who lives in Santiago, who is not associated with a university or anything. She's just a friend, and we told her kind of what we were doing, and she really didn't want to talk about it. And she said her experience of dictatorship was her mother's boyfriends coming home, like having run from the police, having been sprayed by water guns, and it like being a real disruption in her life. So there is like that's one encounter I had that was along these lines, to do with like personal family sort of frustrations and a sense of being kept out of something, a larger political thing that was happening before you were really able to participate in it, but whose effects you nonetheless felt. The other place I saw this, I think, was at a play. This is sort of high context, but this is a play we went to when we were back in New York, called El Año en que yo nací. Yeah, the year of my birth. And it was written and performed by a lot of children whose parents were in some way experienced the dictatorship, and they as a result experienced it. They spent most of the play doing an incredibly beautiful, aesthetically like amazing job of curating the past. And then at the very end, the play shifted really suddenly. Someone asked, well, what's the future of Chile? And everyone kind of paused and said, we can flip a coin. And then the play ended. And that was basically it. So I think there's a strong sense that like there's so much work through that it's almost eaten up the lives of everyone who still has to deal with it. Maybe you can't even picture the future because you still have so much curation work to do.
Yeah, and yet one of the things I think that I saw a lot of were these new contexts in which memory is being put to work, like Javiera Parada's new Marca Tu Voto campaign, where it isn't about memorialization per se, but memory is an actively mobilizing force behind social change in Chile. And so I think, I spent some time visiting friends in the south of Chile after our time in Santiago, and was talking to them a little bit about the work that I had been doing in Santiago, and they were interested, but less in the kind of memorialization processes than in the political aspects that we were engaging with, and the different ways in which the memory work that we were doing was also asking questions about social challenges that are ongoing in Chile. And so I think that there are really interesting ways in the Chilean context where it's not that this doesn't happen in other contexts, but it might be more vivid in Chile, where memory work is taking on these different routes towards challenging present norms and policies to reimagine what the future might look like. Other questions? Yeah.
Well, I think that it's important that if you had spoken to any teachers that teach about the events that took place in Chile, and if you got a hold of any textbooks that are used in the schools, and see how it's presented. That's the way I think the memory can be evaluated. and see if it's been whitewashed in any way, or if it's been presented in what you would consider an honest fashion. Did you have a chance to speak to any high school teachers or elementary school teachers?
I don't.
We did.
We did, yeah.
On the very last day of the plenary, the
Yeah.
closing plenary, that's actually what I was referring to earlier, but when we started talking a lot about curriculum, that's like really what it ended up kind of picking up steam at the end was the conversation surrounding that. And I know less about, like, say, elementary school level education, but I know that on the sort of upper levels, one of the biggest hurdles to producing a sort of collective, I guess, discussion is, does that someone have references that you couldn't share your research information like across disciplines?
There was a real resistance to interdisciplinary work within the academy
Right.
in Chile. That is something
Well,
that
and
is very
it's-
difficult to
It's
facilitate.
institutionalized.
And oral history.
Yeah.
There's no oral history,
Exactly.
that's not a-
Yeah.
So that makes it hard to create a unified curriculum,
Curriculum.
you know, at the highest levels, let alone at the elementary level, right?
Yeah, and then, oh, I was just going to say, if I understand correctly as well, one of the major reasons behind the sort of push for a constitutional assembly, and maybe this is what you were actually just about to comment on, Leticia, since you wrote about Javier Parada, but one of the major things one of the big asks was to get some sort of social studies curriculum put into place as actually institutionalized, as something that had to be enacted across elementary and middle and high schools, etc. I don't have more to say than that was on the table.
Also, another piece of information was that at some moment the curriculum in elementary and high school was changed, and educación cívica, civic education, was basically taken off the curriculum. It's not a mandatory course anymore. So this came up because we were talking about the reaction of school kids and Villa Grimaldi. And one of our Chilean colleagues noticed a difference between a group of, let's say, 13, 14 years old and a group of 10 to 11. So she noticed a shift, after the curriculum was changed, and how they would react or the respect they would show or not show in that space. So yes, as Andrea was saying, it's not only talking about memory, as some abstraction, also talking about in which ways we are also being part of that through education. That was a big part of the conversation.
I'd like to ask the rest of you what you thought about Andrea's distinctions between immersive and distance learning, if you felt that was a tension, and if her partial solution at the end about collaboration, which you didn't much elaborate in this paper, struck you as a reasonable proposition to bridging some of these issues.
I'm really curious too.
Well, I think that collaboration is definitely maybe even better than a partial solution, to the extent that as far as experiential learning goes, there are things that we learn from each other, both cross-generationally and cross-culturally, that I don't think we would have had access to if we were just working with, archives and texts and books and all of that. I think that the distinction between immersive and distant, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think that immersive definitely really strikes me as making a whole lot of sense. Distant, the only tension I see with distant is that I think that reading is still a really intimate practice. And so I'm not quite sure of the extent to which I feel about definitely pushing off that sort of, that research that happens from away. And maybe that's just because I work on transnational literature, so therefore I will always be working from away, and I don't always want to be thinking of myself as alienated and distant. I thought they were really useful distinctions, ones that I would definitely consider to be portable and use.
I think in regards to the experiential, I remember toward the end of the year reading an email from my advisor saying, basically, I wish to work more with you. I'm a first year PhD student, so she wrote this email saying, I wish I could work next year closer to you. And I was reading that email and I was like, as a first year PhD student, I was in Chile, I was in Brazil, and I was, not for fun, I should make that clear, and I was in Mexico. And I have to admit that it was,
No fun was had.
yeah, I try to have fun in between, but it was very bumpy sometimes, or it's been very bumpy. And the things that I learned as a person, as a prospective scholar, as a future professor, I think are very profound. And in that sense, I think the idea of experiential learning, although it's very challenging and sometimes very hard to put into academia, you know, it might be more expensive, it is not feasible sometimes, but I think it would be a very beautiful way of creating knowledge, I think. Now, in regards to the idea of collaboration, I come from theater. I was trained in a very traditional theater department, to so to speak, and I noticed that, at least in academia, even now that I'm trying to outreach, I'm Colombian, and I'm kind of in touch with people at the university level in Colombia, and it's hard sometimes to talk about these issues from a performance studies perspective or from an interdisciplinary perspective, and because somehow these traditional departments sometimes are very resistant. The same experience happened to me when I was doing work in applied linguistics. The same thing, linguists sometimes see language totally detached from social issues. And that is very problematic, I think, as well. So I totally embrace it. I think it's a beautiful thing, it's a beautiful utopia, to say the least.
Well, we have talked about this. You're pushing to the core, because from performance studies perspective, you know, the centrality of the body, basically as a side of knowledge production, is kind of one of the crucial lines as a transdisciplinary field. And I just in that distinction now between like being there or being removed, I remember some kind of anxiety before going to Chile, and I was like, what are we bringing to them, you know? And I was thinking about that when remembering and recalling Maria Jose's performance, and I just told myself, we're bringing our bodies. And in bringing our bodies, we are already doing something else, you know, and we don't know what it is. That is part of also the performative. We don't know where this is going to end, but this is already something that's happening. And I loved the fact that Ivan, in his text, said something really similar. You know, so with this encounter, something is being transformed, and that thing that it's, I think that is because of this mobilization. You know,
and the beauty of doing interdisciplinary work, I think, is also that you don't have to be an expert in a specific field to start a conversation or to contribute. Sometimes well, I don't know, I'm not an expert in architecture, and I thought about this short paper in terms of space, and I did that from my training, basically, by thinking bodies, by thinking about affect, and how bodies also can create space. So in that sense, that collaboration, again, I think is necessary, and I think we should foster that.
I guess I'm the only one who has contributed something to that conversation about the tension between those two terms. And I feel like I would really echo the remarks of my colleagues. And I think the piece that I would add would be, for me, I think I really like the term immersive. I think for me, perhaps, I wonder about the distinction between immersive and experiential to a certain extent. And I think that that perhaps putting it in contrast to or up against distance learning might obscure certain distances that get revealed through these immersive experiences. I think one of the things that I know I found throughout this experience was the difficulty often of bringing together individuals from so many different backgrounds, that it could be very rich and rewarding, and these acts of collaboration could be remarkably fruitful. But sometimes there was friction. Sometimes there were gaps. Sometimes you made assumptions that were perhaps hurtful or even offensive to somebody, and you had to work through those. And that conflict is, I think, in part the most important part of those experiences, but perhaps to suggest that that's all about getting closer is a bit of an oversimplification, because often what it was actually about was recognizing the ways in which we are so far apart on certain things, and also the way in which, for me, this sort of characterization of distance learning as being about, again, sort of separation from the object of knowledge. I'm thinking of like close reading, for example, as being an attempt to really enter into an aesthetic object and to know it in a really intimate way, and that seems like a form of immersive experience that again would maybe complicate that binary in an interesting way. But I do think that the use of these two terms in relation to one another, again, helps us to think about some of these issues in a way that we might not be able to do without that language. So in that sense, I'm certainly grateful for them. Yeah, in the back.
I'm also Chilean, so I want to argue.
Could you speak up a little bit?
Sorry.
That's okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Here, so
Oh.
I wanted to argue two of the things you have talked about. The first is respect to the figure of Allende. I would be careful to refer to the figure of Allende as an empty signifier, like in understanding it as a populist emblem that can be filled with multiple significance. I don't know. I think that Perón might be an empty signifier, but I think that Allende has very concrete significances in Chile that goes from the right wing to see him as a traitor that wanted to sell the country to international communism, up to the left that sees him as a national hero, maybe. But yes, I don't think the figure is used like to mean anything. I think it has very concrete meanings. And the second thing is, I was a little bit surprised when you mentioned that people wasn't comfortable in Chile about the soap operas that were talking about dictatorship. Because the ones I know, there are two. One is the 80s, Los 80, and the other one that is really a 8-chapter serial that's called Los Archivos del Cardenal, the Cardinal Archives. I think they did in my opinion, a very good job of memory rescuing, and I think they had a reception in the left of the country. I think that the discomfort you can find was mostly in the right-wing people that were defending the dictatorship, basically. So I don't know if you're talking about other soap operas or those, or that.
Can you repeat the name of that one? What was the name of that one you said?
The second?
Yeah.
The Cardinal Archives would be the traduction.
I was echoing what Ivan mentioned, as I said in his paper. He specifically mentioned the soap operas. And he's very, very bothered by the idea of trivializing the dictatorship and the regime. My experience, I didn't want to add any more anecdotal experience because it basically echoing the same thing. But my experience with somebody who wasn't related to academia at all in Chile was basically on the way to the airport when the driver from the place where we were staying, middle class, I should say, middle class, he owns his own car, went to university, works on his own schedule, and he didn't want to have a conversation about dictatorship. He was already in the future, as he described himself. But at the same time, not only very much detached from reality, from his own reality to some extent, but with also other realities. So he gave me at some point this statement of there are no poor people in the United States. And I was completely in shock, and I said, well, I mean, at that point, I had to say something, and basically I said, no, there are always been poor people in the United States as well. And as a matter of fact, our economy is it's not in good shape. So I don't think putting the idea that this is the future, as you're trying to basically convey, is the best way in this moment. And, his idea was that Chile was a very modern country, that it was looking at the future, that it was very progressive and very cutting edge with modernity, basically.
I just want to add something that your comments kind of raised for me, which is one of the challenges of doing this kind of immersive experiential work, is recognizing when one of the individuals or a group of individuals that you've been meeting with and talking to and sharing all these experiences with is not a reflection of or speaking for the larger group. That in a sense you lose this statistical sense where if you measured the population, you took some kind of sample and you figured out, okay, 80% of the population actually really likes these telenovelas. But through our conversations, because we have sort of a self-selecting group, it's easy sometimes to hear one view or 6 views and go, okay, well that's the norm for the country. And I think that we work really hard not to do that, but it is easy to hear those voices, those very powerful, intimate voices of people who you've spent time with and gone through these experiences with, and see them as a reflection of a much broader set of views. So I would say that that's one of the real challenges of this kind of work, and I'm grateful that your points kind of revealed some of that. Yeah.
And again, all this happens in across the countries. I can speak the same issues in Colombia with the narco traffic. We have this series of TV shows and soap operas, about the kingpin and Pablo Escobar, and is this glorification of that era, basically, and putting these people as heroes, as they brought us to the promised land to some extent. So you see these rhetorics, the same thing with when I think about Chile and what happened in el Palacio de la Moneda. I can't stop thinking about what happened in el Palacio de Justicia in Colombia and las mujeres de la Plaza 5 de Mayo. So all these connections are there, basically.
Yeah, I would just like to go back again to the methodological issues of doing interdisciplinary work and trying to also do what I guess is like transnational, international, public academic work, which is mostly what I'm interested in too. So this is a criticism, but it's also kind of self-criticism, right? In terms of coming together and these encuentros and trying to connect with other people, and just the very basic, like you were saying, pragmatic obstacles to longitudinal studies that are interdisciplinary, just by the nature of the academy and by the nature of where we live and where we have lived, and these kinds of issues, it's just very difficult, I think, to do immersive work. And to, in some ways, establish relationships that allow us to overcome these tensions, or to work through assumptions, or to kind of come to a deep understanding. So I myself went on an interdisciplinary kind of international study abroad program, and we stayed in hundreds of cities all over the world, and I found that the one kind of terrible thing about this kind of work was that we never actually settled into an environment. We never did do that settling in, building relationships and coming to a deeper understanding. So in terms of how long you stayed there, perhaps, and how long you're now moving on to Turkey, I'm just wondering how you feel about that potential.
Yeah, well, and maybe so this group our members in Chile continue to work with us as we move towards Turkey, so they're actually a part of this conversation, and we had one member of our group in Turkey actually come to Chile as well, and participate in our work there. But this for us is, we are trying our, given the resources that we have, to address some of those more longitudinal issues by facilitating a group that consists of a core group of members who are working on these questions in multiple sites over several years. And so my understanding of the project as a whole is that it's at least a 3-year project, potentially longer if it's possible, and if there's still interest and people are still accessible and interested. And that's one of the neat things I think about this particular group is that we are all constantly learning about these sites that we're engaging with. That we didn't all come in as experts on Chile. We're certainly not. Most of us, or some in the group are, some are not. Most of us are not experts on Turkey. And we are collaborating with experts, and we are working together to identify which objects of study are the most useful and valuable in terms of preparing us to have a productive conversation in these contexts. So even if we can't physically settle into a space, we spend about a year reading around that space, watching films, looking at work by different local artists, and engaging in conversations about those on a quasi-monthly basis.
I think we have to finish.
Yeah, we'll wrap up.
Just to add up on that, one thing that we usually discuss in transnational collaborations along with the Hemispheric Institute is that this kind of event is not the end, it's the beginning of something else. So I think there's a lot of things still to do. That is what I think that is the way that we're trying to conceptualize this. And we don't know what is next, but there's something coming.
And we don't go as tourists. That's also, I think, there should be that distinction. That when we go there, we work with a schedule, and it's very tight. That doesn't give you much chance to really have fun. You miss flights.
Sorry.
So I think that's also it should be clear that it's not from that perspective that we travel to these places.
Yeah, and I know we're out of time, but I guess one thing I say that, first of all, I really appreciate your comments, and that was a frustration, is 5 days. Good luck. And our days were so packed. It was exhausting, and you'd spend months trying to unpack everything that happened. But I think it's useful to make an analogy to maybe the way things operate in the sciences, where if you have really expensive equipment that you need to be in the lab to use, you want to be as ready as possible for that when you are in that little bit of time where you're using it. So we spent a good year reading and talking over Skype to people and all that to prepare so that when we were on the ground in person, we could make as much use of those 5 days as possible.
So with that wonderful analogy, let us conclude. And there's wine and cheese at the back of the room. We invite you all to stay and have a bite to eat and something to drink. And thank you all for coming to this event. It's been a pleasure.